talk a little bit about some research and some own practice that I've been involved in for the last year or so, and kind of leave you with my own questions and also invite you to offer feedback for those who might be able to point me in the direction that I'm hoping this research will proceed. So my own interest in sight dance came from some early experiences that I had, and I'll talk a little bit more in a second about what sight dance is. But I started questioning beyond kind of its aesthetic and artistic possibilities, how sight dance might be used to influence how communities perceive and experience and later engage with and activate their own public spaces. So that's kind of where my own investigations began. And a lot of it started with more of a philosophical approach and looking at a lot of theories and my own experiences, and now is leading me towards a little more interest in the science of it. So again, looking a little bit more into embodiment. When I'm performing in a space, there's a certain awareness and in the moment presentation of it, even if it's not an improvisatory performance, that there's something that changes no matter how long I've practiced it. And with sight dance, taking the performance outside of the traditional theater adds a lot more variables. There are things that require me, whether it be a pedestrian walking across the space to be more aware, planes going overhead, and just these interactions that I cannot predict, and I'm really having to be in the moment. So as a performer, sight dance offers this amazing opportunity for embodiment, that I need to be aware of the movements and I need to be aware of the environment and how we're interacting together. And I start questioning, what does that offer for an audience as well? That you're not stuck in this traditional kind of distanced relationship, that you no longer have to just sit and listen, as unfortunately you have to do right now, but you have not only the opportunity to engage with the space and the performance, but really become an active agent, that you can choose to walk around, that you could even choose to interact, even if you don't quite feel so invited. Within dance, however, it gets a little tricky when we talk about sight dance. As I mentioned, generally it's speaking of performances outside of a traditional performance space, a proscenium theater, a black box theater. Instead, we're taking it out of those settings. A lot of people think that sight dance has to be in an outdoor environment, and that's not necessarily the case. But it gets a little tricky what we actually mean in terms of the relationship between the movement, the content, and the environment. A lot of times site-specific dance is used these days when we're talking about performances in which the history of a site, the usage of the site, all of these things come into play in the performance, but not everyone uses the term that way. And site-sensitive might be less specific. Maybe we're responding to the architecture that's informing our choreography, that's informing the movements, but it may not be that we're actually addressing the history of the site. So again, the terminology gets a little muddled within dance, and tonight I'm just going to continue saying sight dance. But for our considerations, a lot of what I'm talking about is more of this site specific. What does it mean if we really take into consideration the history of a site, how it's currently being used, and then inform the performance from that spot. And some of my interest has been around this buzzword of creative placemaking, and a lot of this is focused on visual art interventions and coming together of different parties that are looking at arts and cultural interventions to change spaces. And some of this you might think, you've probably heard studies of, oh, there was a park that had become underutilized and therefore a site for illicit behaviors, and wanting to kind of reclaim that, we might have a mural that goes in, a public art display, we might create a community garden. So something that reactivates the space and many times involves the community in that new activation. So kind of affecting the habitus, reinforming how we're going to interact and engage with that environment. And so the place and the people start to become in this conversation, that they're working together to create a new sense of place. But a lot of times dance and performance art is not really considered in this conversation. As an ephemeral art, I think that's why it gets pushed aside, that it's thinking, well, it's not going to be this ongoing presence or activation of the space, so maybe it doesn't hold the same benefit. And I question that, and as my research hopefully is leading to show that there can be continued engagement and change through performance even if there's not a physical presence left after the event. Certainly it would require an individual to witness the event. If they weren't there, they're not going to have the same impact. But for those who are there to witness it, that it can stay with them and continue to affect how they interact. Trisha Brown's roof piece, not from 19,771, from 1971, featured a series of dancers on different rooftops in the Soho district. And they were involved in a silent relay of movement. Almost, you could think of it as telephone for dance. That they were just one person would start a movement, it would go across the different rooftops. When the piece was first performed, it was done essentially for a private audience, if you will. She didn't have the licensing and all the necessary paperwork to call it a public event and invite people out to these spaces, and she was just inviting in friends, dance community members to witness it. Presumably other people saw it as well. But several years later she restaged it in what was then a public event. So already we see around this time Trisha Brown was part of Judson Dance Theater and other organizations really wanting to take dance out of the theater and into the public sphere. And this was really part of the ethos of the time that we were seeing, that there was this desire to have art and context. We had land art, or earthworks, depending on how you want to call it. We see, even prior to this, a dismantling of kind of the framing of artwork in traditional ways in museums, really wanting to stop the barriers between those observing and experiencing and perceiving the artwork and the artwork itself. So this has always stuck with me, besides my own desire to go dance on rooftops, of what does that mean to really reduce these barriers and allow an audience to perceive with us. And that I understand different styles of theater, and sometimes you want the fourth wall, and sometimes you're telling a story that you just want to be on display. But other times that when you really want an audience to experience something with you and to be able to bring their own ideas and their own opinions and their own perception to a work, how do you mediate that? How do you allow that and support it to happen? So this is where I start my kind of own research into philosophical theory around sight, place, and space, and how bodies and spaces can really influence one another. As an instructor in dance, I see that we exist, unfortunately, really disconnected from our bodies and from our spaces. So how can, even if we're not dancing ourselves, but how can a performance show us this influence that's happening? Just a really kind of brief overview of this. But space, as I'm using it, is kind of this larger logical, epistemological container, and place being a social product. So we hear from Tim Ingold and others this idea that places are social products. Through our actions, we create places. We come to associate places with certain actions, with certain import, based on the activities or the tasks, as you would say, that are involved with those places. And then sites existing within those is maybe a very specific feature or building within the place. And so again, turning back to this creative placemaking and where dance might have a role, if actions are influencing how we perceive a place and how we define a place and what a place is to us, wouldn't the action of dance possibly change how we know that place? Actually, I'm going to go back 1 second before I talk about that. So in researching this, I started thinking about some other site works that I was familiar with, and Anna Halpern, a local artist who possibly a lot of you have heard of in recent months. She just celebrated her 95th birthday, so there was 95 rituals and a lot of events happening throughout the Bay Area in celebration of that. But she's always been very interested in not only community involvement, but also ideas of ritual and how dance can be a practice for the individual and the community. In 1980, she created planetary dance in response to a series of murders by the serial killer nicknamed the Trailside Killer. So she came to Mount Tamalpais and invited the community in to essentially enact a healing ritual, the planetary dance. And it began at the top of the mountain came down making offerings at the sites to the different women who were murdered, and really was just meant to bring the community back together as the mountainside had been closed. It had previously been a site for hiking, for leisure, for picnics, but because of the scare of the trailside killer, it was closed. A week later, after the first planetary dance, the trailside killer, who had been on the loose for 2 years, was caught. Halpern kind of jokes and doesn't fully claim that the dance brought that to fruition, but she recognizes that it really empowered the community. They reclaimed the space, and also potentially their energies, their efforts, we don't know, brought that to a closure. So it really did become a myth to the community that the dance led to his capture. And the planetary dance continues to be practiced to this day, each year to a different cause. But besides participating in dances, other works by Halpern have allowed the community to really think about their relationship to space. Blank Placard Dance was first performed in 1967, and the San Francisco Dancers Workshop went out carrying blank placard signs. And they walked throughout the city and they asked the community members, please tell us things that are important to you. What can we protest on your behalf? And they wrote the messages out as a way to give voice to these community members and walked back, now carrying signs that had the sayings, the requests, the protests on them. Halpern nor the San Francisco Dancers Workshop had acquired a permit to legally protest. So in order not to be fined or jailed, they had to stand in smaller groups a certain distance apart, which was not anticipated by them, and also not only for their own kind of performance of it, but for the realization for those watching it of what does a public space really mean. If we want to gather and go out into the streets together and have a protest or have a performance, we have the same restrictions. So what is that access to space? What are the kind of invisible boundaries that we're dealing with in our daily life? So that's where it got me thinking of where can dance show us a new relationship to our places and help us understand that relationship of body and place. I also started becoming interested in needing to research in terms of areas of perception, because a lot of this that I'm saying started getting into, well, even if I'm not performing, just by watching it, maybe I perceive what not only that movement through spaces, but what it perceptually feels like. What does it mean if a dancer's walking across the sidewalk versus walking down the side of the building, which was another work by Tricia Brown. So I'm not supposing that without my own experience doing so, I would fully understand and be able to perceive what walking down the side of a building feels like. I haven't had this experience. I've done a little bit of aerial dance, but nothing to this extreme. But there are ideas that by watching things we can couple with them. Alvanoe speaks of this idea of coupling with events through watching. If you're watching a baseball game and you see the pitcher throw the ball, you couple with that experience. You might have a certain sensation or understanding of what that is. Similarly with a dancer moving through space, if they're touching a smooth surface versus a rough bark of a tree, from your own experiences, you can understand, you can imagine, you can project yourself to the dancer and what they're doing. This idea of kinesthetic sympathy or empathy has actually been talked about in dance for almost 100 years. John Martin, who was the first major modern dance critic in the United States and really pushed for modern dance as it was coming into its own, spoke of this, and admittedly his was to really promote Martha Graham and others of her era, but he did speak about how watching performance can impact you and leave, as he would say, kind of traces in your gut and in your body that would stick with you. And so this is where dance has kind of left off, and there's just been this consideration, and maybe as performers we understand it, that yeah, by seeing things I kind of imagine what it might be like to be doing those same movements. I even twitch a little bit when I watch performances, but I was curious how that translates for someone who may not be a mover to the degree that I'm a mover as a choreographer and dancer. And that's what has recently gotten me interested in mirror neurons, and where now my talk goes a lot into my own questioning and encouragement for feedback for those of you who know more about this than I do. But studies in the 1980s started seeing with macaque monkeys this idea that in both performing an action and witnessing an action, the same neurons were being activated in the monkeys. So in a paper published, I believe in 1992, we first see mirror neurons being named as such. And in these studies we were finding, not we, they, found that if a scientist was offering the monkey a peanut, the same neurons would fire as if they were receiving the peanut themselves. And then if they saw the scientist eat the peanut, same neurons as when the monkeys ate the peanut. And so obviously monkey, a little different than human. But as we started investigating, there were fMRI studies and others showing maybe that we couldn't isolate to the same specificity, but we were seeing this mirroring in different areas of neuron systems. And it continues to be kind of questioned what degree we can say this is really happening. And that's where I would like to continue to understand better what is happening and what is the possibility. Because in addition to having past experiences, if we are actually having this kind of experience and activation of as an observer, can that really change how we start perceiving and understanding our places? So Joanna Highgood, another local choreographer, took to the streets of San Francisco in 2010 and staged Sailing Away. So beyond disrupting the busy traffic on Market Street, which caught people's attention and probably disturbed people trying to just get to work that day and go about their business, but also asked people to think about the history of those places. So the work was looking at some early African American settlers within San Francisco who were involved in an exodus from the city in 1858. And so those who knew what the piece was about could imagine the conditions of the early settlers versus today's citizens. And there was a quote from one reviewer who witnessed the dance that at one point they were on kind of near the waterfront, but in a space that today is paved, but 100 years ago they would have been standing in water. So she kind of reflected on having that knowledge and being in that space. She thought not only about the experiences of the settlers, but also what the environment would have been like 100 years ago, a space that she was used to standing on cement ground. And so with my own work, I really wanted to understand how can you communicate those changes and how can you ask an audience to really reflect upon a site. And it might be a site they're very familiar with, but without those little pieces, they may not be able to follow the logic or non-logic of the performance. And that's not to say that I think by any means a dance has to have a narrative, has to have a message, but when you're wanting to do that, how do you help communicate that and bring them along? So in a site dance that I did at Mills College this spring, I did it almost as a walking tour. So I investigated the histories of sites around Mills that in previous generations had been sites of picnics, of festivals, of other Mills community interactions and traditions that had disappeared. And at some moments there was just dancing. And at other moments I was the tour guide telling them in this spot, 50 years ago, this is what you would have seen. This is why this building was created, that today we don't understand why this feature is even here because no one activates it. So my own investigation continues, but seeing where that line is of site dance being able to affect change within communities and our perceptions of places. Thank you.